listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I had the opportunity to interview teen author Asher Warren. Asher is the author of one published work, Maniacal, with more works to be published in the near future. Asher is also the host of the Thin Ice Podcast. During our interview, we discussed his writing endeavors, as well as topics including teenage bullying and horror movies. I'm here with Asher Warren, who is the author of the horror book Maniacal. Asher, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you for having me here.
As I understand it, you write under a pen name. Why did you decide to write under the pen name Asher Warren?
So my real name is Asher Robinson, and when I started writing when I was very young, and I probably publish short stories. I would go by Robinson, but I decided that I got a bunch of I used to get some creepy messages. I got a couple of those from bots or just people in general. I got uncomfortable. So then one day I just sat down with my mom and we were like, let's just come up with a fake name, and we just decided on Asher Warren, and that was it.
Feel free to further introduce yourself to our listeners.
So my name is Asher Warren. I am a published teenage author. I'm 15 years old and I live in California. I started writing when I was 7 and I have been writing ever since. I have written 2 books. I have 2 more in the works, and one of them I published very recently. And that's pretty much me.
Now, the book you published recently is called Maniacal. Did I pronounce the name of that correctly?
Not quite. It's pronounced Maniacal.
Maniacal. Okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
Now, without spoiling too much of Maniacal, what is that book about?
So this book, you've probably heard of movies like Scream, Friday the 13th, those kinds of slashers. I have loved that genre since I was really young, and I thought that writing a book like that would be really cool. So in September of 2021, I wrote this book, which is about a group of teenagers. They're all high school seniors. And final summer vacation, they all decide to go to an island in California, which is out of their state, just for a week on some cabin. And this cabin has a dark past. This is in the synopsis, I'm not spoiling, but back in the 90s, that cabin was home to a massacre, excuse me. And what starts to happen to these teenagers is that as their vacation goes on, somebody starts to pick them off one by one, and they have to figure out who is doing it and what's their motive before they're all dead.
Now, how long is your book in either pages or word count?
So this one's actually very short compared to the ones I'm writing now. The one I just finished writing, word count was 65,000 pages, 350. This one's it's a short, quick read. It's about 150 pages. I'm not quite sure of the word count, but it's quite low. But I did that purposefully because the story that I was going for with this, I didn't want it to be too dragged on. So it's a quick read, but it's I feel that it's entertaining throughout the whole way.
Yeah, and around that's about the middle of what I would consider to be a short novel, anywhere in like the 40 to 80,000-ish range.
Yeah.
Now, your book is listed as having been independently published on Amazon.
Yes.
Did you use Kindle Direct Publishing, which is commonly known as KDP, to self-publish your book, or did you use another self-publishing service?
Oh, I used KDP. I think it's great, and it's just a super easy way for authors to get their book out there, so I use KDP.
Now, what are some other books that you have either written but haven't yet published or are currently writing?
So the one I just finished writing, like I just said, 350 pages. This one is probably my favorite thing I've ever written, like across my years of just writing short stories and books in general. It's called The Trees Are Breathing, and it's about two guys. They've been lifelong friends, and they're getting older, and they have this TV show where they go adventure the wilderness. And for their series finale before they retire. They go to Siberia, and a bunch of stuff goes wrong. And it's kind of like a supernaturalish thriller, uh, and also a drama. And then I am currently writing two novels at the same time. One is a ghost story called Remorse and Regret, and the other one is actually a sequel to Maniacal.
Now, in addition to your work as an author, you host a podcast called the Thin Ice Podcast. What type of content
Yes.
is typically featured on episodes of your podcast?
So this podcast, a couple years ago, my best friend, his name is Ethan, we always used to talk and tell each other funny stories, and since we're kids, they're totally unhinged and just completely off topic and funny, and we thought that it would be funny to share that. So the podcast, it's completely unprofessional on the side, but it's basically just us two having a good time together, trying random gross foods or gross sodas, and just thinking about random things and just having fun as teenagers. That's about it.
Now, how do you manage your time as an author, podcast host, and I would presume you're a high school student as well?
Yes, I'm a sophomore. Yeah, it's difficult. I have a lot of work, but when it comes to writing, I probably shouldn't do this, but I put my writing first. So what I'll do is I'll go home. I write. I try to do 2,000 words every day. Sometimes a little less, sometimes more, but 2,000 is my goal. And then I do work, and then what I do with the podcast is every other Sunday, my friend comes over, and we record an episode. Like tomorrow, we're recording an episode, and we have a guest. It's going to be really fun, and that's how I manage my time.
Now, as a teenage bullying seems to be a big issue nowadays, have you experienced bullying, and if
Yes.
so, how do you cope with being bullied? And is bullying a serious problem in the school you attend?
Oh, yes, this is a topic I would actually love to talk about. So, bullying, I feel like, is a serious topic in a lot of different schools, especially mine. Uh, I've been bullied heavily, especially for the podcast, and because doing it at such a young age, it's something that's hard and not a lot of people understand, and they just like to make fun of it because they don't get why I do it. Same with my writing. A couple years ago, I have this little cousin who. Do you know the game Minecraft?
I've heard of it, but I'm not very familiar with it because I've never played it.
Okay, so my little cousin really likes that game, so I wrote him a short story, and I published it. It's down now, and people around my school would buy that book, wave it in my face, and constantly make fun of me for it. And I dealt with that a lot freshman year, and I think my school is a huge bullying issue. I constantly see people being teased. There's a ton of fights. It's not good, and I think it's a huge problem that schools aren't taking seriously whatsoever, especially mine.
When I was in high school, now this was in the mid to late 2000s, and it was in a small town in east central Illinois, in a rural part of the state. Bullying was a bit of a problem, but not really extremely pervasive.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, as someone who is interested in reading horror books but not watching horror movies, do you enjoy watching horror movies? And if so, what are some of your favorite horror movies?
Horror movies are probably my favorite thing in the world. I've been watching them since I was 3 years old. I probably shouldn't have, but it's whatever. My favorite horror movies, let's go top three. Number one is John Carpenter's The Thing from, I believe, 1982. It's with Kurt Russell. I think it's fantastic. Number two would probably have to be the original Scream. It's a classic slasher. It's one of the big inspirations for my book, and I just love it so much. Number three, there's a found footage movie called Grave Encounters. It's from 2011, I believe. It's really good, and it's one of the only movies to have actually made me uncomfortable. So those are my favorite horror movies.
Yeah, if my mom found that I liked watching horror movies at 3 years old, she would have thought I was possessed.
Oh, it was my mom didn't like it. It was my dad. My dad sat me down on a couch, and he put on the remake for Nightmare on Elm Street and Resident Evil, and My my mom wasn't very happy, but I just got into them. So
Well, Asher, you have been a very interesting guest for this podcast, and I thank you wholeheartedly for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast.
of course, of course. Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you so much. It's been good.
I apologize for incorrectly pronouncing the name of Asher's book Maniacal in the first part of the interview. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all that you're never too young or too old to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACScribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.